So you were just telling me about this incredible news about disclosure that we're seeing all over the place with UFOs in the news.
Yeah, since last Saturday, when this is a great way to bring it to the masses, of course, and it's Tom DeLonge, who's getting famous not now for this as well, besides being the lead singer for Blink 182. But what better way to bring it to the new generation? You know, a sort of rock star and a punk rock star at that, sort of not fitting any categories. You know, he's not a country singer, he's not a rap star, you know, he's no. So yeah, the disclosure's gone ape monkey. So for 30 years or more, the original Georges, what were they? George Adamski. There's the three Georges. I forget the other names, but we're being contacted by other civilizations. This galaxy, we have to remember. One of the obfuscations that's been given to us is that ETs are going to look like some kind of unpredictable spaghetti monster, you know. But the thing that is missing in that, people like super scientism followers, again, my dad was a nuclear physicist. I got a degree in pre-med myself before I woke up and realized there's a spiritual thing going on the planet. Just so I'm not totally talking out of my you-know-what about it. I watched my dad with all his physicist friends and so forth. But the missing link there is that they don't realize that the center of the galaxy actually has information in it. Just like your DNA gives the information to how to grow your proteins to shape all of you. And just like the sunlight itself contains the fiber optic super cable information, talk about super cable is the sun. The information packed in packets of sunlight is the ultimate information. It creates things into formation. It gives us form. The DNA is part of it, but we haven't even discovered the light packets that create the information. Well, that emanates from the center of our galaxy. And for at least for this galaxy, or maybe for this universe, there's many universes, the humanoid form, meaning sort of the mirror image thing, the Vitruvian man, the bipedal, is the form of intelligent conscious life in this galaxy. Now, it takes various forms, sometimes like Sekhmet, the Egyptian goddess. There's lion people in the galaxy. There's mantis people. And if you study the UFO thing, it gets far out, but it's always humanoid. And so one of the objections that scientism will have, well, that's convenient. Wow, they look like us with small variances. Yeah, that's statistically ridiculous. Well, it's because they don't understand the finer energies that actually, we've just discovered DNA. That's all we're at. And we've talked about quantum stuff. Thank you, Bohr and the Copenhagen School and all that stuff in the 20s, right? Einstein, but we haven't caught up with it yet. But so there's a blueprint for humanoid forms. Sometimes they're reptilian looking, sometimes they're Nordic looking, you know, the Scandinavian looking, sometimes they're Peruvian looking, brown skinned, you know, black skinned. These are all these ET civilizations exist. Now NASA has finally admitted there's actually as many grains of sand on our beaches on our planet Earth. That's how many potentially habitable in the Goldilocks zone, they call it, planets in our galaxy. Whereas 20 years ago, it was mathematically proven that we are the only possible planet to have life. It's just statistically ridiculous. We just happen to luck out. They've changed their tune. And this is part of this disclosure that has to be, and we had a huge step in disclosure where ex-Pentagon, 2 ex-CIA guys, the guy who started Stanford Research Institute with the remote viewing at Stanford, Hal Puthoff, are on a team by this young man, Tom DeLonge, ex-rock star. This is how they're going to let it out. And just now before we started, I hadn't seen it, on CNN, can you think of any more mainstream program, mind-controlled media than CNN, or Fox for that matter, depending on what polarity you're into? Or Sky News or BBC or any of them. It doesn't matter. MSNBC, all of it, you know. That is sanctioned media. Now that the august, all the news that's fit to print, you know, the august New York Times, the authority in quote media, the august, the position They work on an article since November with a friend of one of my good friends who was part of MUFON LA or Orange County for many, many, many years and knows the whole inside of all of it. He's been at this for 30 years. One of his good friends helped that guy at the New York Times write that article. Leslie Keene, I think is her name. That's one of Richard's personal friends. They wrote this article for the New York Times, and once the New York Times says that the Pentagon has a UFO desk akin to the X-Files, then it has to be true. And now all the little people that are the newsbot readers, and excuse me if I'm a little bit shoving it in their face a little bit, because it's been 30 years of putting up with people, the tinfoil hat, laughing, sneering, the ridiculing factor. Well, now that the August New York Times runs an article that they researched and that there's an actual Pentagon program, then Good Morning America has to carry it too. Right? So now real disclosure is happening. I just watched Erin Burnett, God bless her, but a newsbot reader for CNN, trying to be a real journalist, but constricted by what her bosses, the people that own the company, that really run all the media, tell her what they can or cannot say. Operation Mockingbird by the CIA admitted to in the 70s, Google it, YouTube it, where the CIA runs our news services. They have planted hundreds of people that kill stories and run stories to massage and manage the programming of Americans. And by default, other people like, God bless you guys, Canadians, you do maintain a nice distance, but I'm sure our toxic mind programming does fucking percolate over the border. Mother Earth doesn't really care. But so now it's everywhere. I just watched Erin Burnett talk to Luis Elizondo, the former ex-Pentagon admitted, running the $22 million budget UFO research with footage of craft flipping. And she asked him point blank. It's a 4-minute interview. You can just Google CNN UFO Erin Burnett. Luis Elizondo, ex-Pentagon, running the desk, running the equivalent of the X-Files desk, but for national security purposes. And she asked him point blank towards the end of the interview, well, what do you think personally? And he answers in the negative, which is the way it softens the blow. He says, well, from our research and in my personal opinion, this is not aircraft that certainly the U.S. government or any other government on the planet has ever had, which is saying, and so she goes, so that's a yes then, that they're aliens or ETs, right? But he can't fully say it. It's politico speak. By the way, once a spook, always a spook. Get real. Are you kidding me? 2 CIA guys, ex-Pentagon guy, they've retired now? They never retire. One of the jokes with the CIA is once you're in it, you never retire. Even when you're running the clam bake fucking restaurant on the shore in Maryland, you're still hooked into Langley. That's just how it works. So what we're going to delve into today, I was surprised I was going to be more together, that I actually, but that's part of my teaching, that you let your emotions be real. And it is a little bit, we've taken shit for 30 years from people making fun of this stuff. And now that the August New York Times says it's so, well, then it's finally so. Who's deciding your reality for you? The New York Times and Erin Burnett or Newsweek? It went everywhere this week. This proves that media is orchestrated. Once it's told to run the story the same night, ABC, NBC, CBS, which here in the U.S. used to be the only sources for news information, all ran practically the same identical story on the same night. Hello? You think this is independent journalism? This is the dissemination of what the powers that be think that you're ready or that they're ready to program you with. And we're going to dissect this a little bit more.
I really can't believe that more people aren't talking about this. I mean, this is an absolutely huge topic. And as you rightfully pointed out, I mean, people have been talking about UFOs, extraterrestrials, and contact for years. We've been talking about the idea of when is disclosure coming. Well, I know that you've talked to many people in MUFON and others who are involved with very high-profile cases, as have I. I've talked to the former Canadian Defense Minister of Canada, the Honorable Paul Hellyer, and he said, yeah, this stuff is real. When we go to the likes of Charles Hull, And others, they have been saying that these programs have existed for a very long time, not just over at Area 51 or Groom Lake, but we know that these encounters going back even into Roswell have been a very big part of American history. And the problem that we have right now is that we're in such a state of cognitive dissonance where we've been told by so many sources, yes, this is happening, this is real, but on the other side, we're constantly told this is bullshit, that you're crazy if you believe in this, how dare you look at this. And the one thing I think is very interesting right now is that we have two sides coming out. You have the likes of Grant Cameron and those in the UFO community that are, always pro government disclosure. The one person that always comes to mind for me is Dr. Stephen Greer, and I want to come back to him in just a moment because I think that he's really been a pioneer in this area ever since the Disclosure Project since 2001, and we know that the Disclosure Project got derailed after 9/11. All the great work that they were doing, it was almost like someone threw a wet blanket on top of it, which was a real tragedy because we had the likes of Sergeant Clifford Stone and so many great people that came out during that time. Major Bob Dean, who's always a favorite of mine. But
I've met him.
Now we have Julian Assange from WikiLeaks. He's coming out basically, doubting these claims, basically saying, there's no UFOs. This is being thrown out as a distraction, putting it on parallels with Scientology. We have Greer saying, that some of the language that's being used during talking about this Pentagon disclosure is it preparing us for a false flag? What comes to mind again is when we go back to those images of Reagan talking about saying, the one thing that would bring us all together is the threat of an alien invasion, basically. Hey, that everyone's going to bring everyone together.
Well, I can't think, but just if there was an alien threat, how quickly we would all band together to fight them. Yes, exactly.
Just like him. That's a great Reagan.
Well, I don't know. I want to say this. Johnny and I know a lot. We're not UFO nerds. That's not our main thing. My main thing is spiritual yoga teachings, personal spiritual awakening. But part of the bigger awakening we cannot not have been subject to over the last 20-some years to much of this information because they go hand in hand. Personal awakening and empowerment of the human is meaning you're going to come out from behind the curtain and see this. So we're not UFO nerds. This is not a UFO nerd thing, but we have to touch on this subject from a different perspective. And we're going to try to shed some insight into what you're bringing up, Dr. Greer, and the other. There's many, many facets to this diamond. This is not a simple, is this a good thing? What's going on? Why? But that's what we're exploring. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting that you brought up also is when we look at these various exophenotypes or types of extraterrestrials, which I think is really interesting, especially when we look at all the incredible and fascinating work over the years people have done documenting ET contact. And there's a great series of books that have been published by Ash Staunton and Albert Rosales that go into this, that look at various ET contactee experiences and documenting them all. And, when we start to see the various descriptions of them, most of them are bipedal or humanoid, like you said. That seems to be the blueprint or schematic. But, what's really interesting to me is that the people I've talked to that have had near-death experiences or even looked at the work with the Life Between Lives work that we find that I've done also alongside the protocols of Dr. Michael Newton, where people have been regressed. We see that there have been these creation suns that spin out souls and sparks, and they come out with unique qualities. And recently I was having a conversation with an author and a former lawyer that started to have these intense out-of-body experiences. And he was taken by his spirit guide into various parts of the universe, and he was seeing these creation suns. And I was asking him how they work in parallel to what people have described as going to a heaven. And this is very much on topic to what you were saying, because we have this aspect where I said, is there one ubiquitous heaven or like afterlife area that people would go to, and would you find aliens there? And that was kind of a question I was asking him, because when you go to these places, you're wondering, people, like he was telling me, you'll see people from different time periods there, dressed in different ways, different architectonics that you'd find on Earth, very beautiful music and whatnot, but it all seems to be, closer to what we experience. And he said, well, actually, the heavenly city for Earth on the other side when you cross over is called Aglaia. And it's very specific to our area, our Earth, our solar system. So there's these different creation suns that suns spit out, and you basically come out in sparks with a soul group, and you have these various biological traits that will go through with the embodiments. But I think it's very interesting, so that we look at these various types of extraterrestrial beings. It's fascinating how diverse it is in the universe.
Yeah. Yogananda describes it, Paramahansa Yogananda is one of my, first teachers, that the material universe hangs like a little basket. He's trying to use an image to try to get through to us, at the time in the 30s and 40s, like under a giant hot air balloon, which people had seen, knew about, the French and the dirigible for several generations. That's the real energy universe, is much, much larger than the physical universe. So it makes sense that we have many, many domains, dominion places, rooms. Jesus calls them mansions. In my Father's house are many mansions. Now I have an actual real story of me talking to Jesus during a medicine ceremony where he's joking to me about the mansions, but what he's meaning there is domains, frequency domains. These are the heavens and the hells, if you will. And they're much larger than even our physical universe of the trillion of stars and billions of galaxies and so forth. So yeah, it makes total sense. That's a whole other thing about the afterlife and how that works. But it's incredibly divinely orchestrated. And so the ET thing would only be if you were a soul. There are wanderer souls, starseed souls, that incarnate in different galactic civilizations. We're not cookie cutter souls. There's Earth spirits who have been grown on Earth, in a sense, or spun off of soul, the sun, the sunflower, our sun, soul, is a being, is an awake being, is a god, if you will. All stars are awake beings. Just feel that for a second. They're ascended masters. All stars are beings that used to be like us, but went quantum. And one of the forms they have in the physical form is to have a few billion years of physical light. Then they retreat back into the eternal light. So the sun even has a lifespan. We know that, right? Stars are born and die. So, but yeah, that's a huge topic. So this latest disclosure about that's happening now, full on, to actually have CNN and the ex-Pentagon Luis Elizondo saying, yes, we don't know who they are. They're certainly not from this planet. In effect, that's what he says. He says there's no known technology we have. They do anti-gravity. They can hover. They can do instant jumping. And they're starting to show the videos. And by the way, there's more of them coming. Linda Moulton Howe, one of the absolute forerunners on this. Again, Jonny and I, at least I'm speaking for me, I'm just a peripheral follower of this. My main interest is in waking people up individually to their own power. Once you're an awake soul, none of this will scare you. Now, there has to be a slow dissemination, So it's been very slow and full of ridicule for a long time, even before Roswell, when I was traveling in Freiburg, Germany, about 3 years ago. There was a crash outside of Freiburg, 1937. That was part of the Nazis, that they recovered that craft. And now we're learning that the Nazis seemed to have had some agreements with certain type of extraterrestrials, some of the Nordics and some of the reptilian, both. It's always the duality, right? And So this is going to be gently now given up, but to have CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, and Newsweek, New York Times, etc., daily news, of course, all the tabloids and all that, right? But we've been slowly been prepared. This is disclosure. This is it. Now it's being given to us through Tom DeLonge's foundation to the Stars Academy, and some people are going to feel, like you mentioned Dr. Greer. A few years ago, I went to the premiere of his movie Sirius when he had it in LA at the Olympic Theater, I think it was. And we sat right in front of him. And I followed Greer. I volunteered to help him probably 10, 15 years ago. I said, if you need anything video, if you want me to video depositions of, let me know and so forth. I was into it. Now, there's multiple points of view. Here's the funny thing, deeper telling. Apparently, Greer and DeLonge met. Greer shared 39 videos with Tom DeLonge. Here's some other videos, okay? Now, Tom DeLonge is from a camp. This is how it works, folks. It's duality on Earth. You're always going to have, this is true, no, that's false, this is true. You're going to have yin and yang duality, and this is going to occur now in the UFO field. Greer and his promulgation is, there's no bad aliens, quote ETs. This is his line.
Yes.
All my labs, military abductions, capital letters, MILAB, and the little gray guys, that's all government-sponsored disinformation, according to Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project. Okay? And all ETs are benevolent. That's one polarity. Now, Tom DeLonge's camp and his 2 ex-CIA guys, the Pentagon guy, that have been trained in the, quote, military-industrial complex, their view is they're not saying it fully yet, but if you listen to Tom DeLonge's interviews with Joe Rogan or whatever, it is a global threat. So this is why DeLonge and Greer had a falling out, because they're polarity opposite. Greer, all aliens are good, it's just humans doing disinformation shit and the secret government crapola, which is true. There's plenty of evidence. I forget the guy's name. Do you remember in Albuquerque who had his own aircraft company that they made go crazy when he was observing Kirtland Air Force Base? Hank something.
About, Ben Rich from not the Lockheed case?
No, not the Skinwalker Ranch. That's what that one is, right? No, this is, I forget his name, but they have intelligence officers that when you discover that there's UFOs that are actually ours, meaning the U.S. government's, right? Mm-hmm. When you discover them, I forget his name, someone can look it up. Just do Kirtland Air Force Base, hang on. Kirtland Air Force Base UFO case. Let me see if I can pop it up here. What was his name? Anyway, he was basically driven crazy by disinformation, American government, and the agents have come forth and said, yes, we did it on purpose. And they'd abduct him at night and they'd make him think he was being abducted by little cyborg the Greys, which are manufactured and have had a base at Dulce since the Anunnaki started. I know we're throwing a lot in here.
The Dulce, New Mexico guy was Phil Schneider. That's one.
That's another guy. But the guy, they killed him, yeah.
Yeah, with piano wire.
Mm-hmm. And he said he was coming. He was a very brave man. He was the son, by the way, of Oscar Schneider, who was part of Operation Paperclip. It was one of the German scientists imported along with Werner von Braun and company, the rocket scientists that have been working with Nazi UFOs. I know this is far out stuff, folks. If you've never heard this before and you've just known me in the spiritual thing, you have to decode all this. But I wanted to point out, so Greer is correct. There is MyLab fake abductions that are done by the U.S. government to confuse issues. They think they're doing it to protect the populace. But there's also agreements that Eisenhower and others made to allow the abductions. So there's real abductions. Again, the duality, folks, learn to discern. In this case, the masses, and this is my opinion, I don't know what you feel, Johnny, but Tom DeLonge and company, I think Tom DeLonge is absolutely sincere. And it's really a brave move for him to walk away from being a rock star for the rest of his life and just having a good time with his millions of dollars to actually try to do something for, quote, humanity. And the reason he came at them by not judging them, saying, thank you for your service, for protecting our country, thanklessly, like the famous speech I just joked with you about in A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson says, you can't handle the truth, I'd prefer you just thank me for the work I do. Well, Tom DeLonge approached the military-industrial complex and said, thank you for the work you do. I understand all this. And I have an idea that we can help disseminate this. And it worked. They went with it. Now, they probably think they've got Tom DeLonge totally puppeteered. This is my opinion. Come on, he's being handled by the ex-Pentagon guy that ran the UFO desk, basically, at the Pentagon, 2 CIA guys, and the mind control guy, Hal Puthoff from Stanford Research Institute, who helped to introduce the remote viewing program for the CIA. Right? These guys are his advisors. So they likely think that he's just a useful idiot, as they call it, meaning he's a good front man to help attract the young people. I agree with that. But I think there's something deeper going on. I think Tom DeLonge, we're all puppets. We're all sort of unconscious channels, whether it's Paul McCartney saying, when yesterday wrote itself through me, for 2 months, I went around and said, where am I stealing this song from? I know I'm stealing it. I've heard it lots of times. And finally, after 2 months, everyone said, no, we don't know where it's from. I said, well, let's record it. We're all unconscious channels in some way or another. I think Tom DeLonge is an innocent. Now, the evil sort of military-industrial complex, if you're on that bent, these are all points of view. We're going to represent both and ask you to learn to discern for yourself. At least that's what I'm interested in, because I see both points of view. But it's interesting that Dr. Greer says all aliens are good, and Tom DeLonge's camp, of course, the military-industrial complex, are going to say, no, they're all bad, which is what's underneath if you study it. They are all bad. So Tom DeLonge and Greer will meet, but they'll have a falling out because they will have two totally, it's a global national threat, and Greer is like, no, this is going to bring heaven on earth. Let's go out into Joshua Tree and send our lasers and our tones and our meditation and invite them on the planet. That's what Greer is into.
Yeah,
right?
I don't think that they are necessarily bad in the terms that we might consider, bad or evil. And evil is just another form of ignorance. And the idea here is that some of these civilizations, what they might see as a necessity, or they might see as something that they don't really have the same empathy or emotions as we do when they go into something. It's strictly scientifically based. So, if they have to wipe something out or move it over, we go, oh, these guys are awful. They have no feelings or whatever it might be. But, out of that position, they might be looking at humans also and seeing all the stuff that we do. They might be saying, hey, these guys are killing each other. They're destroying their environment. Look what they're up to. But I absolutely agree with you with this duality, and I would say that the ETs are already here. They're amongst us. A lot of them look just like us. There's entire towns where they exist in. From some of the conversations I've had, there's all sorts of agreements that have been made. There's some guys that are very much in the know that said if you knew how often you were running into these beings or being observed and how much we are in a great zoological experiment, that
totally.
Everything in our lives that we have is really like a galactic reality show. That's the funny part about it. But what's interesting, I was just talking to you about this in the last day, is that really bookishness does lead to loneliness when we get all our knowledge from books and we read, but that's not always enough just to get our information from the news or to get it from a book. And a good example of that is that quite often I'll get people giving me flack online when I make a video. or let's say before I went to Ireland, I was talking about Ireland. I was talking about the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. Well, I got a lot of shit for that. Just like when I was on the show with you and I was pronouncing from books I'd read Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati. When I do some traveling, whenever I do traveling and I apply the knowledge from the books, they go, "Oh no, wait a second, that's Adam Weishaupt. You're saying that wrong." Or in Ireland, they're laughing at me, going, "No, it's Tuatha De Danann or Tuatha." So we can take this knowledge, but then the knowledge becomes wisdom when we experience it. That's why, because knowledge is useless without wisdom. You can know all about all the conspiracies and all this hidden symbols and why this is that or this occult knowledge, but unless you can apply it to wisdom, as you know, and as you've taught many times, that's where it gets interesting. So the one thing I like that Dr. Greer talks about is he has his ESETI or CSETI protocols when we look at how to actually make contact. And, I think that people can start initiating contact on their own. They can go within themselves. They can start using telepathy, meditation, dream contact, and they can start looking at finding out for themselves. And the exciting part is that now that we're getting a public recognition of this thing, as you pointed out, that tells us that disclosure is heating up and we're getting to that mainstream point. But I still think we have to take disclosure into our own hands.
Totally. We are the ones, so I agree with Dr. Greer about by the way, and this is, look up Carol Rosin, R-O-S-I-N, Carol Rosin. She was an assistant or worked hand in hand with Werner von Braun, the head of NASA, who came from the Nazis, the Operation Paperclip, where we took 1,000 roughly Nazi scientists and said, well, we don't want to waste their knowledge and let's have them work for us. And there's some other stories about that as well, that the Nazis said, sure, we'll work for you, but they kept their own programs going in Antarctica and their other UFO programs, which is a whole nother level of, quote, dark web, dark stuff on the planet. But Carol Rosin said when Werner von Braun was dying in the 72 or 74, I forget when, somewhere in there, he told her, and she was worked for Fairchild and, National Semiconductor, I think, if I got that right, and worked for NASA. She was handpicked by him. He told her on his deathbed, basically the last few weeks or months of his life, in the 70s, there's three things coming. The Cold War, which we're in currently, this is all planned out. The Cold War is artificial between Soviet and the U.S. Again, what Eisenhower warned us about, the military industrial complex, his farewell speech in 1961 in January, Eisenhower tries to tell the American people, watch out for the military industrial complex. He says they're going to find power warranted or unwarranted. Watch out. He's warning us. Now, who would know better? He was the general that saved us from Hitler in World War II and was the president of the United States. On his farewell speech to the nation, he tries to say, watch out for the deep, dark projects that Donald Rumsfeld on September 10th or whenever it was, a few days before September 11th, sat in front of the Congress and said, yeah, we lost $2.3 trillion. We don't know where it is. Well, that lost money goes into black budgets. And that's what's surfacing a little bit here with this latest Pentagon revelation with Luis Elizondo and Tom DeLonge's outfit. But Eisenhower tries to warn us. Who heard it? We were all like going, look, I have a new toaster back in 1961. You know what I'm saying? So he's trying to warn us. And that was very brave of him, in my opinion. And his granddaughter, Laura, I love Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, very brave woman, also trying to work spiritual things, point some of this stuff out. But Eisenhower was a good man, and he had met with the ETs, and he knew we weren't ready at the time, because we were into, look at my brand new shiny 1961 Malibu Chevy, for $3,000, back when a dollar was worth something. But Werner von Braun says the first thing that this agenda by the military-industrial complex, he does this on his deathbed, basically. They're going to have the fake Cold War, which was started after, in the Sputnik and all that. Then he says once that's over, when Gorbachev and company and the wall comes down, then the next thing they're going to go to is terrorism and tin pot dictators. Can you say Kim Jong-il and his son, etc., and craziness? And there'll be a permanent war and massive budgets again on terrorism. That's the current phase we're in. And then Werner von Braun, the head of NASA, who worked with the ETs with Hitler and came over and started the official NASA program here, said the third one will be a fake alien war, a fake manufactured alien invasion. 1972 or 73 or 74, he said this to Carol Rosin. She's talked about it. Look it up on YouTube. So Greer is correct with that. I agree with that. And so you're going to have this. You can't trust what's coming. It's a little too convenient now. Every news outlet is just going, oh, yes, master, we will run this story now. That's what we're seeing right now. CBS, ABC, CNN. Are you kidding me? There's nothing that gets on CNN that's not been stamped and approved by the powers that be, period. You know? So that's where we're at. And what I'm encouraging people to do is wear my T-shirt that says learn to discern. And that's what you hit on, Johnny. We have the power. Many of you here on Earth, 15% of the people incarnate on Earth, you have other stellar lifetimes. You have lived on other planets. 15%. That's 1 billion people. 15% of 7 billion is 1 billion people. 1 billion people on Earth, 1,000 million people on Earth have other galactic history. You have contact already within your soul to other star families. There's a much bigger game going on here. These star families have been watching our zoological experiment, just like you said, for many, many thousands of years. And I do agree with Corey Goode. I know it's a far out stuff with Corey Goode and what David Wilcock talk about, but that there's 23 ET races on the far side of the moon that have been managing 23 different genetic experiments on Earth for at least 250,000 years. There's a much bigger thing going on. The thing I want to encourage everyone to remember, keep your wits about you, keep real God, source, whatever that is for you, in your heart, and know that it's a benevolent universe. And when they try to scare you and fearmonger you with, boogeyman, Osama bin Laden, we must have check every airport, you must have a rectal exam. You know what I mean? That's the military-industrial complex wanting to have the sheeple stay sheeple. Now, if they're going to use the ET thing in a similar manner, the real re-evolution, the real revolution is us taking our power back, talking directly to God's source, to your own higher soul, to your own experience. And when we do that, it doesn't matter what's going to be tried on Earth, it's all going to be exposed. And my insight is in the spiritual level, when I tap into Tom DeLonge's outfit, they think they have him under control. But he's not controllable. Rock stars tend not to be controllable. So he's really going to be influenced by his own heart and his own universe. He may be actually, probably shouldn't say this, the ultimate Trojan horse to get the fucking shit moving. Get it going.
Thing. And that's it. It's also a wonderful Christmas present to us all. And this time of the year that, this is a time when we go within. When, as Rudolf Steiner once talked about, the angels of Capricorn have gathered around the earth, just like the snow is outside on the ground and all the plants and Mother Nature retreats into herself, so are we. And all the truth is coming from the inside and coming from within us, because in our hearts, we already know that this thing is real. We know that our destiny is in the stars, and we're star seeds. It's an incredible story, the human story, and it's been here for a very long time, hidden right in plain sight, all around us in our symbolism.
I want to say, I say this line often to people. I go, Jesus doesn't need a UFO. Krishna doesn't need a UFO. Sai Baba doesn't need a UFO. I know he's controversial. Avatars and masters. Ayahuasca is a UFO. She's a goddess from the Amazon and another star system. These beings, this is what we're finding too. Even this guy from the Pentagon said, and Tom DeLonge mentioned this as well, that the ships, and I heard this 30 years ago. The ships are some kind of amalgam of light and consciousness and strange super layered metals and crystal. Now that doesn't even compute for the vast majority of humans. They're like, I want my Budweiser. This is too much. You know, that's where we're at. We've been programmed. I'm not making fun. I'm just saying we've been kept down on the farm on purpose. We've been a farm experiment, this planet. Look up my video called Galactic Farming of Humans. So the ships, Jesus has a light body. Krishna has a light body. We have light bodies. At night, you're traveling in your light body. Dream work, out-of-body experiences, and so forth. When you become a fully realized, when your eyes get real and you get rid of your veils, when you become a fully realized awake being again inside the Earth experiment, you can turn your body back into light. This is not religious mythos. I'm sorry, scientism people. By the way, this disclosure, as they've said, is going to impact the religious crazy people and the science people the hardest, because their physics is going to be out the window. Newtonian crapola physics is out the window. You're going to go hyperdimensional physics, Stargate jumping, and that has been considered impossible. So the religious people who think, you know, we live on the flat earth or something, or, you know, the earth is only 6,000 years old, this is a terrifying paradigm buster for them, and equally as terrifying with their nemesis, which are the Galilean school of scientism. Okay, right? You have to create whatever. You ever notice that skeptics are just as bad as religious zealots? You know, they'll just find any reason to reject, including ad hominem attacks. They don't want to have real discussion. They don't follow. Neither religionists nor super skeptic science materialists, see, will not follow the basic edict of wise people discuss, fools argue. Wise people discuss, fools argue. That's why they see, from the psychological principle, that which is within me, I see in them, and they scapegoat each other. So the scientists will laugh horribly, whether it's Richard Dawkins or whoever, at anybody who has any extra material ideas, like a Deepak Chopra. Richard Dawkins will want to attack him. And then the religionists will make just as much. It's the same. We see in others that which we're hiding the best in ourselves. When you're in denial, the psychological principle is you see reflected in the world your own denials, and you will project it on others if you're not ready to look at it in yourself. So it's very fun to see religious zealots and scientific zealots are really the exact same frequency vibration.
You know, it's interesting, too, that the Rosicrucians saw our soul to be like the golden wedding garment, which we find in some of the apocryphal texts where it talks about the bridal chamber of Christ, you know, mentionings over in Revelation, that the idea is that we're always weaving this golden wedding garment, and some it's a pale red fabric, but based on our actions, our thoughts, our words, how we're transmuting our life experiences into soul power. You know, this vehicle that you speak of that houses us, this electromagnetic vehicle, is most certainly a very real thing. And that's how some of these ET contacts can come about. And it's interesting that, you know, when we bring up this subject, there's most certainly a lot of people out there like L.A. Marzulli and Tom Horn and others out there who have done a lot of great work as biblical scholars and bridging over the ufology community into Christianity. And, you know, they've brought out a lot of good subjects about the Nephilim over times and the fallen ones and everything. And it's interesting because there are a lot of connections there. And Jordan Maxwell and I, when I'd walk under the stars with him in the desert, he would say, you know, he would point out things to me, like he'd say, do you see that over there in the sky? We would talk about Sirius, which you and I are going to talk about today in its relations to Christmas. But he'd say, well, that's connected to Osiris and the old term Sir that we get from sire. Well, he'd say there's a star connection there. But that's where he said, we find other connections when you talk about a fellow. He says, well, or you fell in love or I fell in love, or hey, that's a fine, that fellow over there is a friend of mine. Well, that comes from those who fell, and these beings that came here. And it's all around us in our speech. It's all around us in our ancient stories.
Anything of one atom, one quantum photon, one amplituhedron, one anything, or any myth, or any culture, or anything, carries the whole cosmos in it. You can unravel anything. That's why masters end up in a place where you can learn all things from watching the water move, or whatever.
I agree. Now you were talking about Jesus, and you were talking about Krishna, and I know a lot of people out there, they have a lot of different ideas about Jesus. There's a lot of religious folks that might be listening or watching this today.
I doubt it.
A lot of people who...
Our audience, they'll be repelled very quickly.
There are some folks out there that are very spiritual, that they'll like some of the teachings that we find within the scriptures. So they've looked at the Sermon on the Mount, or they view Jesus as a master. I mean, Jesus has been mentioned in many places. We also know that in the Quran, Jesus is mentioned as Isa. But that didn't come along till later, by the way. When we see over about 659 AD or CE. So there's a lot there to unravel, and how that connects to Christmas is another subject. But you mentioned that you had some personal interactions with Jesus, and I was wondering if you could touch down on that and basically go into that a little bit for us.
Well, it used to hurt my heart when I would see Christians that were Holy Ghost Spirit-filled, or they had some real encounter. And then it used to hurt me that they couldn't broaden it, that they would get very rigid, like we're Pentecostals or some sect, the 30,800 some different sects of Christianity, the vast majority of which believe we're all going to heaven and nobody else is. So it used to hurt my heart. And so Jesus has come and talked to me 3 times in my life, and at the danger of having the men in the white coats come and get me here, right? But this is very real, and first he just appeared to me once when I was 20. I was in a hotel in Barcelona, Spain, in a little youth hostel, going backpacking through Europe. And he appeared in a vision dream. And I had just started doing yoga with Yoganandas and Kriya Yoga and do my yoga. And I was a vegetarian at the time, probably for about a year. And he appeared and said, pray for your sister. And since I had no churchism, I had no religious upbringing, we grew up in a Swedish atheistic household where it was basically materialism. And we're sailors and scientists. Keep it, that's all we did. And so there was no religion. I don't think we ever stepped in a church. I don't think I stepped in a church ever, before I was 12 years old. So I felt, he's really cool. Seems cool to me. So I started praying for my sister. Well, she had some miraculous experiences occur for her. And later I learned it's what Christians call intercessory prayer. When you ask for someone for something, sometimes you can be an interceder. And it worked. She became a Holy Ghost, Spirit-filled Christian, but she always knew. So he appeared to me and asked me to pray for my sister, and for 30 days, and I did. I'm not sure how diligent I was. And this appeared a couple of other times, but and he's taken me on a tour of our solar system once in a medicine ceremony, and he actually took me to the sun. And as you said, suns were spinning off solar sparks of souls. The sun showed me that exact process. Jesus actually brought me and introduced me to the sun, and then he said, I gotta go, I got stuff to do, I'm a busy guy. And he says, I'll be back to see you later. They're really funny, by the way. The real masters are funny. They're a riot. They're sincere, but they're never deadly serious. They know the beauty behind all of it. What I wanted to say earlier, Jesus doesn't need the UFO. There's gradations. There's hard material UFOs. The little gray guys are pretty much locked into the 4th dimensional reality. Through scientism, you can do some Stargate portals, the Montauk Project. You can do that
Harmonic resonance.
Yeah, you can do it into the 4th dimension. But you can't go higher. because the fifth dimension involves a singing group from the 60s. Just kidding. Involves your heart. Up, up, and away. Okay, that's enough. Stop it. Get out of my head. Anyway, so the fifth dimension starts involving the heart. And if you're just a techno-genetic-based civilization, like a lot of the E.T. gray guys, the little guys with the big eyes, they can't go into the fifth dimension. They can time travel and portal jump, but they can't go into the higher dimensions. And so there's a whole spectrum of, quote, craft, all the way to the light body that doesn't need a craft. When Babaji and Yogananda and St. Francis and a bunch of saints and ayahuasca and Pele and others, Masters, St. Germain, Jesus himself, of course, when they travel on Earth or materialize a body, they don't need a ship. They don't have titanium, bismuth, layered crystalline structures and electrostatic mercury spinning. They don't do it that way. But there are some craft that do that. And then there's a whole spectrum between the crude UFOs, which still do time jumping. They have mercury. They have these amazing properties of spinning vortex mercury.
Like in the Vimanas.
Yeah, and the Vimanas, exactly. That's still a crude craft. Then there's gradations of where the material is actually conscious. The walls are conscious and made of light. And there's a whole spectrum all the way to avatarness of the Christs and the etheric beings that live in the fifth dimension and above, 6th, 7th, 8th dimensions, right? And then there's those that are still in the third, popping in and out of the fourth. These are very, very different. And this is what we're going to learn. There's still, quote, evil, if you will, or apparent evil, the game of duality in the third and the fourth dimension. Once you hit the fifth and the sixth, you're going kind of, well, I shouldn't say that. The seventh dimension, there's unity consciousness. So there is a place where there is no knowledge of good and evil. It's all part of it. There's a reason these things are happening. But to get there, that's a really awakening journey. But so yeah, Jesus is now because of the solar myths of the solar god, which I know you know the details of better than me, of Mithras and Horus and Christ and Krishna. Christos, Krishna, the same archetype, of the solar god, the wounded god, the resurrected god. These are all myths. The watching, is it Isis holding her baby, or the lamb and the calf? These are all Egyptian motifs that were borrowed. So some people will look at that and go, oh, the Jesus myth was made up. And people will write books and say Jesus was a made-up character. Because these earlier myths have the exact same thing: 12 disciples, the star, born of a virgin birth. You're like, come on, they borrowed all that, which is true. They borrowed all that and ascribed it to Jesus because it's such a strong archetype. But if you throw out the real Christ, the Joshua ben David, I call him, not Ben Joseph, because he's from the house of David. The prophecy was he was coming out of the house of David. There's a real being that did that, and then there's the stolen myth that is reincorporated into the solar god myth and becomes the Roman Catholic Church, in my opinion. Or those are very different things. And most of Christianity is run in a mixed fashion. There's a few people that have direct relationships with the Jesus, the ascended master, who turned his body into light eventually. That's very different than the sanctioned religions where they decided, let's steal the gentle Lord Jesus' name and create holidays and borrow pagan stuff and all this stuff, which you know more about than I do. Saturnalia of the Romans. These different traditions. It's co-opting. It's basically people still want central control over the people, or they're going to give you your individual freedom. Jesus is definitely into giving you your individual freedom. Some of people that use his name are into controlling you and keeping you as good sheeple.
Well, this idea about the dying God, the myth
Yeah.
of the dying God, and the regenerating with the light, is a very, very ancient idea. It goes back into the ancient world. You know, I would say that we bring it back into the Atlanteans, and it was passed down. As you mentioned, that we have some connections into the Egyptians, Assyrians, Akkadians, all the way through into the ancient world. And I want to touch down on that for sure. But, you know, when we look at the idea of Jesus and we look at the idea of Christendom or Christianity, you know, traditionally we've had two types of Christians. So we've had the Gnostics on one side, and that comes from Gnosis, or we have the heretics who, when we look at the Nag Hammadi or the Coptic scriptures, that we have one side over here, and then we have the branded Christianity that started to evolve during the time of Constantine. So we have a very interesting story here, because even in the name we find clues. You know, Jesus, or Jesus, we have a Greco-Roman adaptation. And if you talk to any scholar out there and you were to talk to them about Christ, they would laugh at you, because Christ isn't a name. Christ is actually a title. It means to be anointed. And as Jordan Maxwell always tells me, and he's pointed out many times in his books, you know, he relates it to Crisco oil, you know, in joking. But, I mean, he's talked about this in Matrix of Power. He's talked about it in the book your church doesn't want you to read.
That's a good title.
He's talked about it in the book he did with Paul Tice, That Old Time Religion. And so he's looked at Jesus, but Jesus really is very much like a composite character. So we have to look at it like an onion when we look at the story of Jesus and pull back the layers. And this is a very beautiful story. It's nothing bad. There's nothing evil about the story of Jesus, you know, the myth of the dying God. And there is, I believe, a historical Jesus, as you mentioned. And so when we look at the story of Jesus taught in modern day Christianity, as you mentioned, it's greatly allegorical. It draws from Mithraism and other solar messiahs. In fact, I have a few books here that go into the various sun gods that we've seen and where they all come from. But again, it's connected to the ancient imperial sun cults. And when we see the story of what I believe is the historical Jesus, we would get that in the Gnostic Gospels, the Pistis Sophia, and the books of the Savior. But we really have to see that a lot of these books that would have discussed his life would have been destroyed in Christendom by the Council of Nicaea and the Ecumenical Council. So really the churches that we have today draw from the Gospels and the Epistles, and we really have fractions fragments that were added by the ante-Nicene and post-Nicene fathers. And in the apocryphal Gospels, when we go look at them, we really find more about the life of Jesus. For example, in the book of Thomas, we find out that he was performing miracles, such as he was molding sparrows out of clay and bringing them to life. And I remember growing up, I would see you know, movies that were made about the life of Jesus, and he was molding these sparrows and they were coming to life. And I thought, well, I didn't hear about this in Sunday school. And, you know, it's very interesting, you know, even in the Arabic scriptures, it describes Jesus as being an astronomer. In the Talmud, you know, we find other stories that are in relation to him. And what I think is also very interesting is that Christians will often tell you, they'll say, well, Jesus, you know, was mentioned in the writings of Flavius Josephus. And actually, in those writings, we know that those mentionings were actually a forgery, which is kind of shocking because in actuality, the mentionings of a Jesus are very scarce. But, you know, that there is quite a bit that we can learn by looking in these various non-canonical texts and apocryphal writings. You know, you've actually delved into this subject quite a bit, the historical side of the Jesus outside of the solar Messiah, and I believe you made a video about it, didn't you?
Well, yes, I get it more directly. Again, you make the myth, in this duality world, we get Dr. Greer's camp and Tom DeLonge's camp in the UFO field. This is part of it. Until we unify, until we have a unified field theory, thank you, Einstein, we will flip back and forth. So in this case with Jesus, you're going to have the real esoteric, the Christ, the thing, the anointed Melchizedekian Christed avatar that Jesus, the man Joshua ben David, becomes, and then you're going to have the myth, or the canonical, manipulated again to keep the, and often sometimes by well-meaning people at the Council of Nicaea that say, look, the reincarnation is too, these people will just get lazy like they do in India, they just say, oh, next life I'll be fine, and there's no motivation. There's some truth to that. So they might think they're helping people by saying, let's take that out and just scare the bejeebers out of them with hell to get them to shape up and stand up straight, and we'll introduce this concept. Now, is that good or bad? Often it's neither, it's both. It's, if you're interested in the realer connection, I recommend do your personal own, you are the seven churches. In the book of Revelation, when John's talking about the seven churches and the seven stars, that's your seven chakras. And as these seven seals open up, these are experiences he's having as his chakras are opening up. It all makes sense. Every time you go a bigger layer of the onion, it makes total sense, So
it does make a lot of sense. And the interesting thing about the idea of a historical Jesus is that we again learn about his various travels through the Talmud. In these non-canonical texts, we learned that Jesus would have visited Alexandria, Egypt, which is, by the way, where we get the Nag Hammadi connection with the Coptic Christians. And this was a very liberal place in Alexandria. You had the various schools and various occult teachings there due to Ptolemy, Alexander the Great's friend. And it's interesting, when I was visiting the various temples in Egypt, especially over by Dendara, Hathor's temple. In the back, we have on the ceiling, we have all the astrological signs of the zodiac, and of course, there's only a replica there because the other one was moved to the Louvre in Paris, where I was just visiting. But it's interesting that after that, we find that he would have come to Syria. And after Syria, it's believed he would have traveled eastward, going over to India, discovering, all the mysteries there and studying there. And as you mentioned, Jesus was a part of the Melchizedek order, which is believed. There's an author that I know in Lebanon, Karim El-Kusa, and he's written a book called Jesus the Phoenician, putting that idea forth as well. But of course, we go back to the French mystic, Edouard Chouret. He talked about how the historical Jesus would have been a member of a messianic group, the Essene sect, that taught carpentry and occult practices. And so this would have been a group that was founded by Pythagoras with the Pythagorean teachings. And, this would have been someone that would have been initiated in history schools. And I've talked about this before at when we were at a ET Contact Countdown to Contact ET conference, because I said, I do think there was a historical Jesus. And one of the reasons that I think that is because Jesus was skilled at speaking in parables, as well as there's other hints and clues in the story that we see someone who definitely had a mission. But of course, I want to bring out this point that just because there are solar attributes to Jesus, and Jesus' story is exactly the same as Dionysus. It's the same as Bacchus, the Lord of the Vineyards. The similarities there with Mithra. There's the solar god that's born around the winter solstice with the Annunciation, the Immaculate Birth, which I want to get into in a second with you. The Other attributes that we find with him, we find that he has very much the same titles as Dionysus and the others. You know, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Lamb of God, the Savior to humanity. These are all very ancient titles, that came along a long time ago before Christendom. But these are really a compliment to him. You didn't get these things assigned to you by the mystery schools unless you were someone very important. For example, you know, even in the stories that we find with Alexander the Great, how he died at 33 years of age on the doorsteps of Babylon. Solomon's temple was built, took 33 years to build, stood for 33 years, the 33 vertebrae in the spine. You know, this is very much connected even to Jesus, lived for 33 years. We find stories like that connected to the great Christian king Charlemagne. So whether it's Moses, whether it's Samson in the Bible, who has the coronas or the locks that are cut, these are all part of the solar myths. And this doesn't mean that the person never existed. It just means that, like, when you looked at a great statue, you know, the wise would always know that there were the multitudes of peoples bowing before the statues and worshiping them and kissing their feet. The wise stood back and said, we understand that there's the personification of great truths hidden in there. So there's the actual hidden in the literal. It's an encoded, you know, an encoded document. You have to turn the lock 7 times, as the mysteries would teach us, before you would unlock the mystery. So I think it's really quite incredible that we pull out that there is an actual and a literal.
Yeah. As you just said, the carpentry school, I had a new insight, a new aha, a new revelation grok about the whole reason the thing about we think Jesus was a carpenter.
Yes.
Yes, but now, don't want to shock people, but the original stone builders of Egypt and Atlantis and South America as well, where they could, with their ankh and their staff, tone and tune and sound and light and vibrate and cut stone and lift and demagnetize stone, of which Solomon was the remnant, and you know, he floated stones. No one dragged stones around. That's not what happened. In Stonehenge, they didn't drag those stones 200 miles or whatever it was. They didn't do it, okay? They didn't do it at Sacsayhuaman. They didn't do it at the Temple of the Sun in Ollantaytambo, Peru. They didn't do it, no. So those, and I don't know, you know more about the Masons than I do, but then there's, this is the real carpentry, is the Masonry, the ancient tradition when the gods came. The Venusians, the Ra people, came and made that pyramid. Maybe they built it in one night. It was all just there. Maybe it took some time and they floated the blocks and they had, you know, people that were taught how to do it, and then they would just place them in place, but they would demagnetize them, degravitize them with certain aligned granite blocks have very different frequencies that we don't even know yet why they need that particular stone for the central chamber. They call the King's Chamber. It's not a King's Chamber, it's the Ascension Chamber. But I just had a whole new insight why the remnant watered down version is he was a carpenter. He was actually a master mason of the universe, in the sense of being able to, he's a master alchemist of the universe. So I just had a whole new insight on why it trickled down that we thought he was working with Joseph sawing wood in his carpentry shop in Nazareth. That's not what it was about.
Yeah, you know, and that's interesting because when Edouard Schuré, you know, looked at these ideas, his theory about the whole carpentry thing, that Jesus the Nazarene was possibly mistranslated from Jesus of the Nazarites. This idea of these occult practices in carpentry very well could have been symbolic for being not only, you know, the builders of temples, but the builders of men. But, you know, it's interesting because...
And wait, I want to expose. That's when you have the Gothic cathedrals. I don't know, was there 500 of them all built in a 100-year period or something? Right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Greco-Roman architecture and everything, Gothic.
Where does that come from? All of a sudden there's this explosion of incredible stuff that we couldn't even probably have a hard time doing today with flying buttresses and stones up to the heavens and beautiful stuff. all getting done, because that's the impulse of the ancient, in a good way now. There's, of the Masons. So Jesus was a master constructor. That's where they get the carpentry thing from. He didn't have a wood shop in the back of his. That's not it at all. And this came from the original magic would be the Great Pyramid. But even before that, the Atlanteans, and then on Mars and on other parts. And these are, just like the Greek temples are a manifestation of etheric temples. The Greek temples.
The one thing you'll notice with those temples too is you'll notice the principles of aesthetics that the Greek philosophers had and had back even from India. That the Neoplatonists, when we especially when we look at various writings like you see the different writings about in Plotinus in his essay on the beautiful. You see that the importance of beautiful buildings and architectures that raise our consciousness. And there's no doubt that with the Freemasons and the likes that, pulled their teachings in from the Templar Knights, had some sort of encounter, as Manly P. Hall always pointed out, with the Eleusinian and Dionysian artificers. So this comes into this beauty and in these temples and these sacred places and holy places.
Master builders. And just like the UFOs have a spectrum of physical, aluminum, bismuth, titanium, whatever, and element 115, and these mixes, and they align them in layers and layers and layers of crystal, and this creates certain things, all the way to light. The same with buildings. In the etheric dimensions, this is the Greeks were tapping into it. That's why the simple thing is when you take a tour of the Parthenon, someone points out, well, it's not actually really straight. They've adjusted just 2 inches or whatever it is, so it looks straight it looks right for you. It's not mathematically perfect. They somehow adjusted those 2 outer pillars of the Parthenon because it didn't look right, because they wanted the aesthetic beauty to affect you. So they would have, and that's, yeah, so that's a whole nother topic, but we could go off into that.
When you go into the other stories of Jesus, and I have a few good books here about Jesus, but this is one right here, The Mystical Christ. This is by Manly P. Hall. This is a classic. He also talked about it in 12 World Teachers. That Manly P. Hall went into the story of Jesus. He looks at the area when we start off, first of all, into the Jesus story. It says, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, it is written that Joachim, which would be the J sound for us, looks like Joachim, but with a Y in the Hebrew, was a man of great piety and considerable wealth. And as we look at the story, this really is where we bring Mary into the picture and the Immaculate Birth, because according to this, Joachim visits the temple of Reuben and talks to the high priest of Israel, and what they say to him, it is not lawful for thee to bring us gifts because you have not fathered a child. So as the story goes, he and his wife Anna have a daughter named Mary. Now here's some symbolism for you, because Mary was only 12 years old. And I know this sounds bizarre. People go, oh my God, a 12-year-old Mary is getting hitched up with somebody for basically a wedding at that point. But there's lots of ancient symbolism and allegorical keys here, with the actual hidden in the literal, with the number 12 being connected with the constellations, just like the apostles, and vice versa. So at the time, Joseph was 90 years old. And this, as the story goes, as we learn about the Jesus story, this would have been almost shameful at the time. Here's a 90-year-old guy who's they're trying to hide their relationship. So the idea is they were scrambling around trying to hide in caves, and we get the idea that there was this running around over the mangers, and there comes the story that we lay out the rest for how Jesus was supposedly born through this immaculate birth that didn't have any conception, that there was the Messiah comes about, and it was preceded by a visit from the angel Gabriel, who gives a message. And so I think, we start to look at where there's an intersectionality point, where do we cross over from the actual story, into the literal. Well, of course, someone would have had to have sex to have a child, to give birth. But, we have this very idea that was probably passed down by the church to give more of a sacred image. And, most recently, when I was talking to Garnet Schulhauser and looking at his books, he's the fellow I was telling you about that had these out-of-body experiences, and he had some experiences on the other side, re-examining his religious perspectives. The idea that he comes with in his book is that, well, you also have the idea that the early church fathers, they would have been trying to promote this idea of the sacred role of Jesus, as well as, the priests needing to follow a certain lifestyle. There has to be this idea that sex was a dirty, forbidden thing. So again, we get the story evolving, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, there's something in the story of such an archetypal being as Jesus, it gets so multidimensional. He appears as Quetzalcoatl to the native shamans in Central and South America.
Kukulkan.
Yeah, Kukulkan. And he's actually doing this. So when he ascends, he's in multiple bodies. This is a known Yoga Patanjali's sutras explain this, avatars. That's why the Hindu gods are depicted with 20 heads and 30 arms, because there's many, many forms and multidimensionality. And so in the Jesus story, he would appear, obviously end up in South America, he would appear as their highest form of a god, which would be a feathered serpent for those shamans. He can fly, and he's also got the power of the Kundalini snake. That's the form he'll take for them, not as a Jewish rabbi. It wouldn't make sense to them. So he takes the form that they'll go, oh, that's the highest form that we've seen through all our vision quests and so forth, and here he is actually personified. So one thing to keep in mind or keep in heart is the Jesus story is not easily boxable. You can't go, well, this is what happened. So is it true when the Essenes, the sect, the mystical sect living outside of Jerusalem, down towards, I forget the name of that mountain, but anyway, they towards the Dead Sea there, they found some scrolls there as well, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes, they were invoking the world master, the teacher, the Son of God. They were invoking him, and Joseph of Arimathea was part of it, and others, and they knew ahead of time, and so they were kind of the weird mystical sect at the time, right, that others didn't understand, which always scares the general population. So they kind of had to live by themselves in a commune type situation, right? But they would go into the temple, and they were actually letting Spirit choose who was going to carry Jesus. Who was going to carry Jesus as a child. And later the Theosophical Society tries to do this with Krishnamurti. They want to create the world teacher, right? It's very interesting stuff. I'm just encouraging, I know Jonny and I are throwing a lot of stuff out there, but the Jesus story is much, much, much bigger. The real, you can always go inside yourself, like my sister had. Her name was Christina, obviously. That was her birth name because her path was to be with Christ. And it was very, very real. She'd get messages from what she called the Lord that were super accurate for me. And her and I always had an understanding. But there was no way her husband, who was part of the Calvary Church, could understand why your brother is so far out and so weird. It didn't fit. So the mystical teachings are always, whether it's the Essenes back in Jerusalem, being the weird ones out there, invoking this Messiah, predicted Messiah. And Joseph of Arimathea is a very interesting character. He is very wealthy. He is the wealthiest man on the planet at the time. He has can travel the Roman Empire. He has tin mines up in England, and he's got all kinds of stuff going on. And he's basically, quote, the uncle of Jesus. But there's also some ideas that he was actually the physical father of Jesus. That's the real Joseph. And he is also the same personage as Merlin, who later, in 600 after Jesus, tries to do it again. They try to bring the heart, the Christos, the centered in the form of King Arthur, the King of Hearts, back in. And again, Merlin is the father of the King of Hearts, trying to bring him in to help establish a divine, benevolent frequency vibration on the earth, Camelot, if you will. You know, so when you go deeper and deeper, these stories, Joseph of Arimathea, I would point people to, and then they have the surface story, like you said, you know, about what that scares people.
Yeah,
it doesn't
fit. The whole story about Jesus is a very beautiful one, especially the one we have in our Bible, because, again, I had done some videos before. I did a video called The Christmas with Jordan Maxwell, and I also did another one talking about the real Christmas story. But, you know, when we look at the Christmas story, as Jordan has often gone into over the years, and, you know, Manly P. Hall did a wonderful book, another one called The Story of Christmas. And I highly recommend everyone check out Manly P. Hall's books at the Philosophical Research Society if you want the full story on this, or listen to his lectures he did on this, which are really fabulous. But, you know, we could start asking questions such as, okay, for those out there who say Jesus is the reason for the season, okay, let's examine that. So if you say to a scholar, when do you think Jesus was born? And you look at the clues in the Bible, well, the Bible says that when Jesus was born, the shepherds were watching or minding their flocks in the fields. Well, at that time of the year, there would be no shepherds. So some have said, well, maybe that leads us into the area of April, you know, based on some of the clues that are there. But actually, the Bible also says that Jesus was born 6 months from when John the Baptist was born. And if you look in the book of Luke and you look in other areas, you start to see that, okay, well, there's a few clues that we have that we can pinpoint, different astronomical clues, and scholars have looked at this. Okay, so that leads us around to the end of September. In fact, some have gone as far as to say that leads us right around to about September 23rd. So it's very interesting that why then do we go to the idea of Jesus being born on December 25th? And the whole story starts to unravel for us then, because even the idea that Jesus was crucified on a cross, and a cross is the ancient crux symbol, or it's the ancient symbol for the sun. You know, the cycles of the sun. The shorthand is the Celtic cross when you see the 4 seasons or cycles of the year. You see that Jesus was crucified at a place called Golgotha, which there has been no place ever discovered called Golgotha, but it means the skull. So when we ask Jesus, who were you in the Bible, he says, I am the light and the truth. Well, yeah, he is the light, and he was crucified with a crown of thorns or sun rays or coronas. So this story of Jesus and the 12 disciples, or the 12 constellations, is very much aligned what we find with Dionysus. Again, you mentioned Horus. You know, when we look back to the very stories with Mithra, and Mithraism was very popular at the time in Rome, and there was actually these things called Mithriums underneath Rome. And if you look up what a classical Mithrium looked like, it's basically what your modern Masonic lodge looks like, how it's been set up. And in fact, these Mithriums, there's been one that was preserved recently that is actually on display over in London right now, where it just was. But anyhow, even the name Son, like we talk about Son of God, there's a very interesting etymological clue there, because as Jordan Maxwell's pointed out to me, he's pointed out this connection to sun, S-O-N, and just like S-U-N in our language, and in the Germanic is S-O-N-N-E when we look up the sun. And actually English is Low German, so we find a fascinating connection there. But again, with the solar myth, it's a very beautiful one, because a long time ago on this planet, not only did we have the sons of light here, that we also call the serpent gods, connected to the Atlanteans. You mentioned Quetzalcoatl. We talked about our Quetzalcoatl, as well as Kukulkan, Zoltan. All the ancient serpent gods, which are connected to the 33 vertebrae in our spine and the Kundalini serpent energy, or the Negav, the awakened beings, the masters that were here. We also find this story of Christmas being the most ancient and important story to humanity. It's a very, very beautiful story, and it's not bad or negative or evil, and you haven't really, you haven't looked at it if you think that way. You haven't looked at it properly, because religion should be treated like a science. This is a fascinating science, this story and how it relates. And it really goes back to the idea that to the ancient people, they marveled, at times with the solar energies. They marveled at the sun. They marveled at the moon. They weren't necessarily worshiping these things, but they understood their importance. And the personifications of this importance were of the highest spiritual qualities of God. These ideas being passed down into man were very important. And so if any of you out there have actually checked out Graham Hancock's new work, Magician of the Gods. And you've checked it out, haven't you, Tobias?
No, I haven't read it yet. I haven't looked at it yet.
Well, in his new work, he explores not only the idea of there being a cataclysm, and there definitely was a cataclysm around 12,000 years ago. Some say 11,500 years, 12,860. We have different theories that there was something called the Younger Dryas Cataclysm, and this corresponds to what we actually find not only in the Bible, but it corresponds to, even what Brian Forrester's been saying in his work, but with the Younger Dryas Cataclysm that geologists tell us about, that there was an asteroid or solar storm, something that happened that came here that even Robert Schoch has found with the water erosion on the paw of the Sphinx. Well, something happened in the middle of the Atlantic, which we think is connected potentially to Solon's Atlantis story, that area was decimated. The polar ice caps were melted, the water levels were rising around the world. Things changed drastically for humanity. There was a push out. Humanity starts to change its migration. Graham Hancock has looked at Göbekli Tepe over in Turkey, and even when I was in Turkey, looking at these different places, visiting Kushadasi and over in Ephesus, you can see where the water levels were much different. Even in Malta, when I was there, looking at the Neolithic areas and the tracks, you can see where the tracks used to go right down into the water of the Mediterranean. That was all changed. Humanity got pushed out at some point, not only underground and became subterranean in many parts, as you all seen in Cappadocia and other areas, but of course, we know that Northern Africa became very big. The Atlantean rulers moved over into those areas of Northern Africa, Egypt. So in the Northern Hemisphere, something started to happen as humanity was re-emerging their spiritual and otherwise traditions and how significant these things are. So this is where the Christmas story starts to begin. And I'm not talking about Christmas traditions that we find that were developing over later in Western Europe and started to merge forward with the Byzantine peoples and whatnot over in the 4th century. But I'm talking about Christmas in itself in the great allegorical sense. And I just want to lay the foundation for this before we go forward. So how this begins is like this. We start off with the idea that of Leo the Lion King, that is the brightest in the summer, in that part of the world, and it's coming down on the people. And this is nice and warm, and people are doing good. You have crops, and things are nice and hot. And this is, again, where we find the lion is very significant with the Lion of Judah, as we refer to Jesus sometimes. You see the lion in the various iconography around Asia to the Assyrian people. You find the lion in Mithraism with the leonocephalic head. You find the lion over with in England and over in London. You'll find it in Trafalgar Square or on the flag for the Royal Standard. You'll see the lion over and over again, and this lion lion is an ancient solar representation, and it's just like Disney's The Lion King, with the mane of the lion being the coronas of the sun.
Right.
So 90 degrees later, we move out of that. We start to see a great story happen of astro-theology. And this is why the whole New Testament of the Bible is actually an encoded document. It's been translated so many times by the papal decree. It's been, put together in sevens. It's very specific. The mystery schools had their hand in it. Sir Francis Bacon had his hand in it with these translations. And again, we see the great Rosicrucian mysteries attached to all these things. But as we look at the alignment here, the sun goes 90 degrees later, or 90 days later. We move over to the birth of Jesus with Virgo the Virgin, which is also symbolized and connected to Bethlehem, the house of bread. So after, Jesus is born through Virgo the Virgin, or like Mary, there's a very close similarity. We find then after we move over into Scorpio. So Scorpio is Judas in the Bible. Judas gives Jesus the kiss, betrayal, which is like the backbite of the scorpion, and the scorpion leaves two little kiss marks. And again, as Jordan has pointed out many times, that you wouldn't need to kiss Jesus when we see the story about the Garden of Gethsemane. And we, of course, on the night to much be remembered, there's far more that we see mentioned that could have actually happened in one night, because it's symbolic, of course. So after this, we see this incredible transition that takes place. And of course, even when we weigh the scales of Libra, we have a whole part of judgment and whatnot in that story. But when we come to the story of Christmas, Christmas is where it gets exciting, because we have the story of death and resurrection. So we find that the sun is in the sky, does something very special around the winter solstice, which today is actually the winter solstice as you and I are recording this. The sun dies or disappears, so to speak, somewhat in its degrees. From the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, we find that it is sort of moving back, and then we have its with the 25th, it's being reborn and moving closer and coming back. So you can actually see this encoded all throughout the world. Not only in the Yucatan, we find solstice encodings into their structures within Kukulkan, the various pyramids, but over in Karnak in Egypt, and where you and I were in Ireland, you were over by the hill of Tara. Well, you can also go over to Newgrange, and it's awesome in Newgrange, because then we see the solar symbol from 5,000 years ago. We find the solar symbol of the crux formation of the cross. You walk inside of it in this cross chamber, a 5,000-year-old rock monument that's like the size of a shopping mall. You walk in it, there's a little portal above the door, and the light on this week of the winter solstice goes through the portal of the door and lights up the cross chamber. And this is from 4th century BCE, 3800 BCE. I mean, that's amazing that a primitive Neolithic people were able to do this. So, again, this is a very ancient story. It's about the light of humanity, coming into us. And just like we're judged in the temple, well, the temple is the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And that's why I think this story is transformative. It's beautiful. That's why it was applied there. And there's a system there. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, the Christmas, and of course then the appropriations of all the pagan cultures, right? When Christianity starts moving out, it wants to incorporate these, whether it's Santa Claus who is in the colors of the Amanita mushroom, that Santa Claus is red and white because it's the Amanita mushrooms of the Siberian shamans and the Swedes and Russia. This are the psychedelic plants. The Christmas tree itself is actually your spinal column, and the lights are your aura, your energies, the star, the enlightenment, the crowning glory. We appropriate them, mixing the shamanic and the Christian theology, and the church was very good at everywhere to, co-opt in a sense these traditions or include them, or the people would rebel too much. You have to give them what they want. If they still want to slaughter their Christmas pig in Sweden like the Vikings do, then you better let them do it, and you better have the Yule ham, or whatever, right? So, yeah, the Christmas tree is actually very beautiful for me. I love it. I don't like to cut them down. I don't do that now. But it's not the end of the world, it's fresh. So what's more powerful than pine? Pine it's literally your spinal column and your chakras and the glories in your aura. That's the ornaments. The ornaments of the Christmas tree, and the star it's the rising of the Kundalini up the tree to the glories, which is which is the enlightenment, which is the circle of Buddha, which is the Christed being. Yeah, that's what I see with the Christmas tree.
So the idea that we have about the light from the Christmas tree, it all comes back to, again, the astro-theology and ancient mythology, and again, to the mysteries we learned about the great year that Plato talks about with the yugas, or the precession of the equinoxes, that we have an axile rotation to the earth, and it goes in various areas. There you go, 25,920. Okay, so between that and 26,000 years, we have these various ages, and the ages are based on the axile rotation of the Earth and where it points to various star bodies. And the ancient mystery schools and the masters would map these out and record them over the ages. And so when we look in the Bible and in the ancient texts, we start to learn, even in the story of Moses, when we find that he's destroying the golden calf. Well, that was during the Hindu reign, or the age of Taurus. And the Taurian reign was why we still have sayings with the holy cow in India, don't have a cow, and Oxford University, and the connections there.
Oh. I'm sorry, my doggy's wanting attention. Allie, off. You settle down, girl. There you go.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
After that, he comes with the shofar horde, which shows us, Aries being introduced. And by the way, the end of the Taurian age, we also find with Mithra ripping the head off of the bull. So as we progress forward in our signs, we find that Jesus is introduced into the story later on with the age of Pisces. And actually, it's very interesting because in the story of Jesus in the Bible, we find this continuity of astro-theology all the way through in the symbolism, because Jesus is also multiplying two fish. He encounters two fishermen. And that's why you want to be fishers of men. We see the Piscean connection. And so we have a story of astro-theology there, which is quite amazing. Actually, it's very interesting that Jesus also says in the Bible, I'll be with you to the end of the age, or I'll be with you, when he says over in Luke 22:10, he says actually, meet me at the house with the man with the water pitcher. And so what that is that showing us, when we look at it, an age or an eon, what that actually means in the translations of the Bible, is that the man with the water pitcher is actually Aquarius. As right now, we're moving backwards. We're leaving out of Pisces. We're going into Aquarius. And Aquarius is, again, the man with the water pitcher, bringing the waters of spring as the sun does. And so we're moving out of that period where Jesus was with us for that particular period. But all through this story, we find astrological significance. First of all, the three wise men are the three stars of Orion, and they're pointing over to Sirius. We find that Venus, which is also representative of Lucifer in mythology, the brightest star, the morning star that's announcing the light that's coming, figuratively. We go over to Sirius, the star Sirius, just like in Peter Pan, it says, follow the second star to the right. Well, that's Sirius, the dog star, where we get dogma. We find that even the Holy Grail, the story of the Holy Grail, is the crater constellation. Again, we were talking about Virgo the Virgin. We are talking about this is all pointing towards the east. Hence, in Freemasonry, the blazing star of Freemasonry is Sirius. So this star configuration is as pointing to the east with the rebirth of the sun. And it was because the ancient people, you know, they were suffering out there in the darkness at night, where the wild animals were, where they couldn't, you know, they were worried about things, they were scared. In the daytime, things were safe. It was warm. It was life-giving. So this is very important. So again, taking this story forward, we find a connection to the Christmas tree. And the Christmas tree, as you were talking about this, is very ancient. We have lots of mythology connected to it, not only across Europe. Later on, of course, we go into Yule, the stories of Yule, and your background, you know, having a connection to that part of the world. We learned about Odin, Freya, Balder, and Thor, and Balder being the sun god. You know, the idea here, though, with the Christmas tree actually has a bit of a gruesome story to it. And it's connected to the idea of the sprig of an acacia, or the sprig of an evergreen. And we find connections to this in other solar stories. You mentioned earlier, we were talking about Horus. You were talking about, in this story, a very important being in Egyptian mythology. So we see the various aspects of the sun. And again, Horus is where the sun rises on the Horus has risen, the horizon. That's why you have Horuses in a day, or hours. That's why you have 12 Horuses, the steps of the sun, and the various types of the sun gods. Basically, so the evil brother of him, Set, which is why the sun sets, had murdered him. And his father, of course, the evil brother of, when we go back into the story with Osiris, again connected to Sirius, had been murdered. And Osiris, which is sort of the son of the underworld, had been cut up into 42 pieces. And various parts of him had been scattered all over the place. Of course, one part was in Baalbek in Lebanon. Another part was over in the Aswan in Egypt. Anyhow, when he was murdered, the blood trickled down from him into the ground, where later there came up the sprig of a tamarisk, or an evergreen, this green representing everlasting life. And the only way he was able to be brought back to life is when his mother Isis reattached his phallus, and by reattaching his phallus, sat on the golden phallus and brought him back to life, which in Egypt, in the temples, some of the temples, you can still see the phallus being reattached. Again, that's a very Lorena Bobbitt-like story, but the interesting thing about this story is that it's very ancient, very ancient. We find it with the Phrygians, with the story of Attis, which became Adonis. We find this story in Freemasonry, with the story of Hiram Abiff, the widow's son, who was accosted by the three ruffians, Jubala, Jubalo, and Jubalam. He was murdered, brutally cut into pieces, and he was buried at the brow of Mount Moriah, where the sprig of an acacia confucius, the same constituent, one of the same constituents like Mimosa hostilis, that is considered to have dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, in it, which grows, by the way, near the Sinai Peninsula. And that's got an interesting connotation to it too. We also find this in the Bible, in the story of, when we connect it to the story of Jesus, we have the mentioning of the Jesse trees. And I thought I had a picture here, I do, of one of the carvings of, this is supposed to be the lineage of David, of the Jesse trees that they mentioned. And this story is very... they're very much connected, because again, we find with Osiris, his mother had resurrected him. Mary Magdalene had come to the sepulchre after 3 days, which is very symbolic. We find that there is a regeneration, the light coming back and springing back to life, like we find in the Easter story. But again, with the Christmas tree, when we go into Europe, we also find the light being connected, and the evergreen aspect of everlasting life and light coming back back. And there is a very important story to Protestants when you look into the story of Martin Luther. One of the legends about Martin Luther is that he was walking one night under the stars and saw all the billions of twinkling stars, and we found that there's an idea that he was the first one to light the candles on the tree. But Christmas being the return of the light, or the light on the Christmas tree, all very important, even to Hanukkah, with the festival of light, with the story with the Maccabees and the ancient Jewish people regaining their independence with the Greeks and everything that went on. Again, we find the light coming back into this part of the world. It's a very ancient, it's a beautiful story. It relates to humanity, and I think that it's universally appreciated.
Beautiful, Johnny. I'm always impressed by your knowledge, and I always learn a lot when I hear you. I learned a bunch of things right there.
I'm impressed by yours.
No, to remember that, so it's the returning of the light. So we've taken the historical Jesus, who was likely born in September, if you look at astrological signs, and maybe the Venus was over the star for the wise men or whatever. But we don't have to fight it. It's, the solar return is a beautiful myth, and the light returning. So whether that's putting out your Christmas lights that you bought at Walmart that were made in China or whatever, or you're actually doing it the old school. When I was a kid, we'd light the actual candles. We'd have them on the Christmas tree. Now, these were fresh Christmas trees, so them catching fire was kind of unlikely, even when the wax dripped there, and you had to blow out the candles at the end of the night. We would literally have, my family probably still has the little attachments that you put the candles in. Obviously nowadays the fire marshal bill will not allow you to do that, probably. But anyway, so all of this is a returning of the light, and you can learn beautiful details, and it all makes sense in the macro, so the micro, in the micro, so the macro. Johnny knows a lot of beautiful details. Or you can just have the ahas that I like to do because I'm lazier about, Jesus Carpenter, master mason, actually constructor. He's the magician builder, the magic builder of energies, of literal temples and so forth. And it all reflects back to that, whether it's Gothic cathedrals or in the pure form, the ceremonies that we did, and that's Egyptian. It all ties together. So, but at this time, at the solstice, the standstill of the soul, and it turns into the return of the sun. And now it's an ancient, beautiful thing. I was just sitting outside this morning. Now I live in the Valley of the Sun. Here in the winter, we're down here in Phoenix, Arizona. We call it the Valley of the Sun. But this was the first cold day. It was 48 degrees when I went outside at 9 a.m. this morning. That's cold for us. 48 degrees, right? Might even have been down in the 30s tonight. And my mandarins, I'm going to have to make sure I watch so they don't freeze. But anyway, so this is the returning of the light. That's the message of the season. And it's not arguing with people about the historical accuracy of Jesus or when he was actually born, that the mind ego loves to do. We love to be right? But for those of us that enjoy that, but if we keep the spirit first, and if people love watching the Mormon Tabernacle Choir sing their stuff, then go with that if that's what your family does. Find the love, find the returning of the light, the returning of something where we can share some common light with each other is what I recommend for people. I do very little now. We used to do a giant Christmas dinner, but we adjust it. And since I don't have little kids except dogs that are easily satisfied with a tennis ball, but I'm sure we'll buy them a bunch of goodies and all that stuff. But yeah, and Santa Claus is, people go, that's Satan. Don't get caught up in all that fear porn is what I say. Look, take the imagery, the archetype. How does it feel to you? Is it loving? What do you want? Do you want a commercial Christmas? Do you want a return of the light that's in your chakras that give you the life force? This is up to you, what you want. Let the tradition serve you, enjoy the details, or just enjoy the feeling of it. It's up to you. So it's fun to explore all the details with it. And also we're going to have a lot more light shed on the subject of UFOs, coming all the way back to where we started this coming year. This is the return of less obfuscation, less secrecy, more disclosure. And it's just going to happen all across at this time on Earth. The age of Aquarius, the water bear that Johnny was talking about, and Jesus refers to it, is we're bringing back the liquid age, the electric age, the light age. You know, we've gone from Taurus into maybe a little bit of fish, and now it's going to become liquid. Aquarius is even more liquid than the Piscean age. So there's a return now. Some of it will be shocks to your system, you know. The ET disclosure that's going to go on with all that is going to be shocking to a lot of us. It's a big deal. Humanity's growing up. We're not going to be caught in the dark as much, like that saying, we're not going to be mushrooms anymore, fed bullshit and kept in the dark, right? So return the light. Let the light come back and invigorate you and infuse you instead of confusing you, conning you and infusing you in a confused state. Let it infuse you and fill you, and whether that's the Christmas tree or you going to your church or enjoying talking to the sun like I was this morning, doing the ancient Gayatri mantra, which is an invocation to the sun itself. However you do it, you know.
I think that's beautiful. And, you know, speaking of the age of Pisces, the age of the fish, if you want to go and online, go on the web, onto Google, and type in the oldest Christian church, type in Megiddo, Israel, and what you'll find on there, on NBC, CNN, you'll find a picture that you'll find these archaeologists that are dusting off a floor mosaic of two fish, which says that, you know, even prior to what we look at as Christendom, you know, they were looking at this idea. And actually, you know, another beautiful thing about this is that, as I was mentioning, the place Golgotha, where Jesus was said to have been crucified, which means the place of the skull that doesn't exist. If you think about it, in your skull, that's where the prefrontal cortex of the brain is, as I was mentioning with the temple. And this is what I've talked about with Jordan before, too. This is where the light and the truth within you comes from, the darkness that's in the world, because we know the word devil is just evil with a D in front of it. The word Satan people use is just accuser or opposer, or the law of cause and effect, your karma. So this is a beautiful story about your light and your truth, as you mentioned. And, you know, there was another fellow in Egypt, and his name was Akhenaten. And Akhenaten, you know, we have a story with him. Again, he was the rebel, as some have said, king or pharaoh, who was said to have led everyone out of Thebes into Arman. He was trying to get away from the age of Amen, which right now, if you notice, as Stephen Mailer points out, that when you say your prayers in the three Abrahamic religions, they all end with Amen. Well, Amen, like Amun-Ra, is the return of darkness, the return of silence. And he wanted to return to the age of Aten, which was the sun. And he believed this solar disk was like a monotheism. That's why Sigmund Freud links Akhenaten to the character, one of the characters who could have been the historical Moses, even though Moses is really a composite character. So this idea of going back into the sun, going back into the light, symbolically, that light is the light and the truth of the universe, of all things. It contains that love and contains that universal truth. So I think that's a very beautiful message for this season. And I love how you also finished that, what you were saying there, Tobias, by talking about the UFOs, because disclosure is a part of the light coming and touching down on everything, you know?
Absolutely. So that was a lot of good stuff. And I thank everyone for listening in and gain and glean those things which are helpful to you.
Have a happy winter solstice, Merry Christmas, and a very happy New Year to everyone. And we'll see you all soon.
Awesome.